It started as a family Christmas, only to become a national nightmare. Before we go any deeper, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss any updates on this investigation. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what you believe really happened that night, because today we're re-examining evidence that has been buried, recut, and debated for nearly 3 decades. What you're about to hear will challenge the story you thought you knew about JonBenéт Ramsey's death. This is an investigation into the final, brutal moments of a little girl's life and the possible cover-up that followed. On the morning of December 26, 1996, 6-year-old JonBenet Ramsey was found dead in the basement of the family home in Boulder, Colorado. The nation watched as headlines raced from kidnapping to murder, and the story hardened into 2 competing narratives: an intruder who slipped through a basement window, or something far darker that happened inside the house. For years, the intruder theory dominated public imagination. Footprints, an odd ransom note, traces of unidentified DNA. But a patient, granular re-examination of the scene, the forensics, and the family's behavior revealed inconsistencies that refused to be ignored. When physical evidence, recorded interviews, and behavioral patterns are read together, a startling portrait emerges, one that locates the most plausible explanation not outside the house, but within it. Let's begin with what we can say with forensic clarity: the injuries that killed JonBenet. The autopsy recorded a devastating blunt force trauma, a skull fracture so severe it created a long, spidering crack across the bone and coursed with internal bleeding. There was also evidence of a physical assault using a wooden implement that left splinters and paint traces, and finally, a ligature fashioned to constrict the neck. Those 3 elements, the blow to the head, the paint splinter assault, and the ligature, comprise the brutal sequence of her final moments. They are no mere speculation. They are medical fact. How were those injuries inflicted? That question became the fulcrum on which competing theories swung. One critical piece of reanalysis focused on an ordinary household item, a large black Maglite flashlight found upright on the kitchen counter. It was conspicuous, almost deliberately placed, and wholly wiped of fingerprints. Even the batteries inside were spotless. For investigators who know what a fingerprint-free household object implies, the finding is alarming. People don't typically strip a flashlight of prints. They do it when they want to remove the link between the object and its handler. A controlled reenactment offered a technical but chilling result. Using a flashlight identical to the one in the Ramsey kitchen, experimenters, including forensic analysts, struck a replica skull with force equivalent to what a 9-year-old could generate. The fracture pattern, the shape and bevel of the wound, and the distribution of force matched in an unnerving way. The conclusion: a Maglite-sized, cylindrical object could produce the pattern of injury seen on JonBenet's skull, and a child of Burke Ramsay's age and size could, physically, have delivered such a blow. That reality does not, on its own, prove guilt. It does, however, place a plausible weapon within reach of a child who was known to have had the flashlight in the house that night. Which leads us to the bowl of pineapple. It sounds mundane, but in this case the pineapple became a timeline-busting piece of evidence. Autopsy results showed fresh pineapple in JonBenet's small intestine, pineapple that had been eaten within 1 to 2 hours of death. Photographs of the house that night revealed a bowl of freshly cut pineapple on the dining table. Forensic testing linked fingerprints on that bowl and the spoon to Burke and to his mother, not to an outside intruder. If the family's official timeline, that JonBenet had been carried to bed and slept through the night, were true, the pineapple should never have been in her system. Instead, the pineapple suggests she was awake and downstairs, minutes or an hour before she died, in the company of someone who had been handling the fruit. Burke's prints are on that bowl. That connection collapses the family's earliest alibi. Then there is the knife found hidden in a small cupboard just outside JonBenet's room, a red Swiss Army blade engraved with Burke's name. The housekeeper had earlier confiscated and hidden that knife because of how obsessively Burke used it. She had watched him whittle, tie knots, and practice precise cuts for hours. On the night in question, when investigators examined the blade, fresh carpet fibers were embedded in its edge, fibers that matched the carpet in the very cellar room where JonBenet's body was found. Coupled with testimony from Burke's scout leader that he had mastered the exact type of slipknot used on the ligature around JonBenét's wrists, a pattern begins to form. A child with tool access, knot tying skill, and fingerprints that place him at a crucial scene element. Behavioral records and interviews deepen that pattern. Weeks after the murder, Burke was brought in for a child-friendly interview with Dr. Suzanne Bernhardt. The setting was designed to be non-threatening: toys, soft light, no uniformed officers. But Burke's responses were disturbing in their composure. He told the psychologist, without typical trauma's tremor or cling, that he still felt safe in the house where his sister had died. When asked if he missed her, his answer was a clipped, "I'm fine." He later drew a family portrait that omitted JonBenét entirely, a symbolic erasure that child psychologists regard as meaningful. At a moment when most children display fear, regression, nightmares, or emotional outbursts, Burke's flat effect and a sudden declaration, "I have a secret," and then refusal to reveal it, raises a red flag for those trained to read such things. 2 decades later, Burke's adult interview on Dr. Phil revived those alarms. He smiled inappropriately during grim discussions, he used hedging phrases when recalling key facts, "I want to say," and when asked bluntly whether he had killed his sister, he did not offer the quick, unequivocal denial an innocent person often gives. He pivoted instead, "Look at the evidence, or the lack of it." Statement analysts flagged that evasive linguistic pattern as a potential indicator of concealment. Others warned against leaping to conclusions. An introverted man put under a studio light can look different, anxious, or socially awkward. But the behavioral mosaic, childhood flatness, the omission from drawings, claimed secrecy, and adult oddities under pressure, must be weighed alongside the forensics. Used together, they complicate the intruder narrative. The physical crime scene itself offers other, quieter proofs that an outsider's entrance is unlikely. Those who argued for a stealthy intruder pointed to a broken basement window as the probable entry point. But a close look at the scene photographs shows spiderwebs intact in the window well, undisturbed dust and pine needles settled on the grate, and shards of glass resting on the ledge where a hand or knee would have moved them if someone had climbed through. Reenactments trying to replicate entry required disturbing those elements. The real scene remained undisturbed. A single high-tech boot print pressed in a fragile dust on the cellar floor, once touted as evidence of an outside listener, had no accompanying stride pattern or trail. Federal agents and investigators who moved through the house had worn similar boots. In short, the physical evidence at the point of entry does not comport with a forced outside intrusion. If an intruder did not come in through the window, if footprints and drag marks are absent where we'd expect them, and if the ransom note and flashlight bear the marks of staging or deliberate cleaning, then the crime looks less like a violent home invasion and more like a constructed scene. The ransom note, 2.5 pages long, written on paper taken from the family notepad, demanding the oddly specific sum of $118,000, the exact amount of John Ramsay's recent bonus, reads theatrical, not urgent. It quotes movie lines, adopts odd syntax, and contains internal contradictions. It is the kind of document that, under the microscope, smells of performance. Who inside a family would have access to the precise bonus figure? Who inside would have time and motive to craft a note that looked like an abductor's demand? These are not rhetorical niceties. They are evidentiary gaps begging scrutiny. Let's be clear about one thing. None of this is conclusive proof of intent or identity. Courtroom-level certainty does not spring from reenactments, behavioral reads, or circumstantial patterns alone. Yet when every thread is drawn together, the Maglite that could match the fracture pattern and was found wiped clean and staged, the pineapple that establishes an underground timeline, Burke's fingerprints on the bowl, the red Swiss Army knife with carpet fibers, the sophisticated ligature knots consistent with Boy Scout training, the intact spiderwebs at the window, the theatrical ransom note. The balance of probabilities starts to tip in one unsettling direction. Consider the alternative hypothesis that the documentary reanalysis and investigators advanced. A domestic accident that escalated into tragedy, followed by concerted efforts to hide the truth. In this scenario, A 9-year-old boy, acting in a sudden flash of anger or during a moment of inappropriate exploration, strikes his sister with a heavy object like the Maglite. The wound is catastrophic. Panic erupts. Adults in the house face a devastating choice: tell the truth and risk criminal exposure for their child, or stage a narrative that will direct investigators outward. The latter path, the one the evidence of staging suggests, requires careful orchestration. Cleaning fingerprints from potential weapons, planting or positioning misleading items, writing a ransom note designed to misdirect, and coaching a child to stick to a rehearsed timeline. The immediate decisions made in those hours would determine whether the case unfolded as a solvable homicide investigation or as a long, public saga of ambiguity and accusation. There is weight to that alternative. Several accounts indicate rapid legal and public relations action immediately after the discovery, lawyers on retainer within hours, family friends whisking children away to other homes, and a strong insistence on controlling access to interviews and records. Burke was not formally interviewed without attorneys present for months, and when he was interviewed, his responses displayed patterns of consistency and deflection that many investigators regarded as coached. Investigators who later re-examined the case noted that a child accompanied by multiple lawyers, reciting tightly knit lines and using adult language about death at times, was odd, not because the child was clever but because the preparation itself suggested the adults wanted a specific narrative to hold. Another deeply troubling line of evidence centers on sexual and physical trauma indicators. The autopsy noted injuries and traces that some experts interpreted as signs of prior physical or sexual abuse. Reports that JonBené had recurrent infections and other medical markers, and the behavioral reports that Burke smearing feces and engaging in inappropriate acts with his sister add a grim context. Children who exhibit scatological behavior often do so as a manifestation of severe stress or sexual trauma. If such a pattern existed in the household, it reframes how we interpret both the events of that night and the defensive, secrecy-driven actions that followed. Yet the case has also shown how dangerous it is to build conviction on suggestion alone. Over the years, other suspects surfaced, DNA analyses produced mixed and partial results, and public officials made controversial statements, at times declaring the family exonerated based on trace evidence, at other times acknowledging a lack of prosecutable proof. DNA recovered from JonBenét's clothing and beneath her fingernails contained male profiles that did not match family members, which to some suggested an outside intruder. But those touch DNA samples were fragmentary, degraded, and inconsistent across items, and when advanced testing later found multiple unrelated profiles, the forensic picture became more ambiguous, not less. James Kohler and other investigators urged caution. Contamination, factory origin DNA on garments, or scene contamination could not be ruled out. The scientific ambiguity allowed narratives to proliferate: intruder, family cover-up, serial predator, while the true thread that could stand up in court remained elusive. If you listen closely to the documentary re-examinations, one message repeats: the investigation was crippled at the start. Crime scene procedures were not followed strictly. By the time investigators had a real chance to lock down the scene, family members had moved the body, handled objects, and admitted guests had been allowed to roam. In a homicide, early scene security is everything. Once evidence is moved or manipulated, reconstruction becomes speculative. That procedural slack, combined with rapid legal insulation around the family, created a fog that decades of forensic advances would struggle to break through. So what now? What does a responsible, modern documentary do with this clustered evidence? The flashlight, the pineapple, the knife, the knots, the behavior, the staged window, and the theatrical note. Responsible inquiry does three things. First, it distinguishes between what the evidence demonstrably shows, injuries, fingerprints, fibers, timeline markers, and what is inference. Second, it tests competing hypotheses against that evidence, not against the most sensational possible narrative. Third, it holds open the legal and moral presumption that none of this equals a conviction without a court of law and beyond reasonable doubt proof. When an investigator like James Kohler pieces together a case and says, "If we follow the evidence, the likely explanation is domestic rather than intruder," He is offering a considered hypothesis grounded in forensic reanalysis, behavioral interpretation, and timeline reconstruction. He is not delivering a verdict. He is calling for renewed scrutiny of what happened inside that home, and for transparency in how the evidence was handled and conveyed to the public. For those who watched the original story unfold, the most difficult part of that call is not the suggestion of accident itself. It's that a family's response, the immediate legal strategy, the staging, the coaching, could be read as a willful attempt to preserve reputation over truth. Human beings will do almost anything to protect the living from the consequences of a child's actions. That impulse, combined with wealth, lawyers, and media savvy, produces cover-ups that can last decades. The raise of that calculus is a moral one. Protect a son and let the justice system fail to hold the right questions in front of investigators, or confess and accept the legal and social fallout. History shows families often choose protection. We end where we must begin, with JonBenét. She was 6 years old, alive one night and gone the next, and the world has spent decades spinning theories around her death. The evidence we've reviewed, the skull fracture, the paint splinter traces, the ligature knots, the Maglite reenactment, the pineapple timeline, the knife with carpet fibers, the staged window and note, and the patterns of family behavior and possible coaching, collectively paint a picture that cannot be dismissed. It is a picture that points to an accident followed by a cover-up as a plausible, distressing explanation. If one accepts that possibility, it forces us to reconsider the questions we ask, the people we scrutinize, and the assumptions we have made about where danger comes from. Documentaries and investigators can push and prod the facts, reframe timelines, and test hypotheses. But they cannot replace a court or a confession. What they can do is keep the conversation alive, push for transparency in sealed records, and demand that evidence be retested with full chain of custody integrity. They can make sure unsolved grief does not calcify into comfortable myth. If you take away anything from this program, let it be this: the most painful truths are not always the most dramatic. Sometimes they are the quiet, domestic tragedies we prefer not to imagine. Tell us what you think. Do the pieces we've outlined here change your view of that night in Boulder? Should sealed records be opened? Do you believe the intruder theory still stands? Or does the balance of evidence now point to something else? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you want more deep dives like this, subscribe and turn on notifications. We'll continue to examine cold cases with fresh eyes and rigorous skepticism. And finally, remember JonBenét not as a headline, but as a little girl whose death still demands answers. The search for truth is rarely neat. It is rarely quick. But as long as questions remain, the work of finding those answers must go on.